funded.
Part of the blame rests with SEPTA. It aggressively took on the labor unions and won, but SEPTA itself did not have a plan to pay for the years of deferred maintenance on the train lines. And it was the one body that knew better than anyone else how bad the train lines really were. The transit agency hoped then, and it hopes now, that the money will be forthcoming. But the federal, state, and local governments weren't offering money to help fix up the train lines in 1983, and they still aren't. Yet the needs were clear to anyone willing to take a look. This is what SEPTA and the public acquired 5 years ago. 232 miles of worn track, 171 broken down train stations, 344 crumbling bridges, and more than 300 aging passenger cars. The Coleman Report graded most of the train system in 1985 as poor or fair. Since then, SEPTA's made emergency repairs, but it's done little to address the chronic needs on the rail lines. 5 years after the takeover of the regional rail system, the so-called bottomless pit is not under control.
I can't stress enough that the facilities we have just don't last forever. There's a point in time where those things either have to be replaced, rehabilitated, or you just have to stop using them because they're not safe to use any longer. And we're at that junction. We've got to make those kinds of decisions. And what happens if we don't is that the system will shrink under its own weight, because management will have to make decisions that in order to operate a safe system, and our operating dollars are being consumed more and more in maintaining our plant and equipment, that means there'll be less and less service, because our budget just remains pretty much fixed, or it decreases a little bit every year. So given those constraints, the only thing left for us to do to operate a safe system is to constrain the system.
You have several lines out of service now. The Westchester line is out. One of the Chestnut Hill lines is out. You've got the Ivy Ridge is out. So it's happening. The thing is gradually closing down. You know, a little while, you may be left with a beautiful tunnel and a mural in Center City and no trains.
It's clear then the mass transit system needs money, but to get it, SEPTA needs to convince the public that it knows what it's doing.
You can't sit back at SEPTA like they've done and feel sorry for themselves and keep saying, well, nobody's giving us money.
SEPTA needs to speak in a clear voice. It needs to exhibit leadership and unity. Events over the last 6 months have sapped morale at SEPTA. At the board level, there's a lot of fence mending that needs to be done. People aren't going to fund an organization they can't trust.
People at SEPTA could announce that today is Thursday, and if there were 10 people in the audience, 5 would look at their calendars, and the other 5 would wonder why we announced today was Thursday. The credibility is atrocious.
The SEPTA board is at the center of the credibility problem. There are 11 members, 2 from each of the 5 counties in southeastern Pennsylvania, and the governor has a representative on the panel too. From almost the day SEPTA was founded, the board has been balancing suburban interests with city interests, balancing the needs of mass transit with the politics of the region. The fact that politics is a part of the equation at all has hurt SEPTA.
I think the reputation, the political reputation and the board and how it's directed is probably seen as the worst situation in the industry, not just in the transit industry, but of any public utility. You go anywhere in the country, people will talk about the rift between the counties and the city and how that's manifested itself over the last 20 years in a gradual decline of obtaining funding and having consensus long-range plans and all that. And people aren't guessing at it. You simply look at what's happened the last 20 years, and the evidence is right there on the ground.
Part of the problem is the way the board is set up. The majority of votes rests with suburban board members, where ridership, for the moment, is lowest. When people talk about changing the structure of the board, the discussion turns to representing the interests of riders and not politicians.
The problem is that it is a structure that makes for irresponsibility, a lack of allocating funds in a targeted way, simply because people have greater power than their ridership. For instance, Philadelphia County has about 85% of the ridership, and all of the other counties, the 4, have the remaining. One county has about 8, another county has about 5, 2 other counties have 2%. But the 2% have the same voice in spending, investment decisions, planning, as the 85%.
Then there's the role of board members. What are they supposed to do? Represent the interests of their political units, speak for riders, or act as independent agents on mass transit issues? There are no explicit requirements to be a SEPTA board member. Most have been attorneys and accountants, not people with backgrounds in mass transit.
I think what we have in common with one another is that we all have seats on the SEPTA board. And on occasions when we come together in committee or in the board meeting, we all probably breathe the same air, but that's it.
There is nobody up there with any experience of running a big corporation. I mean, this is a $500 million operating budget, another $220, $30 million capital budget. And except for Pat Swigert, who is the chief administrator at Temple University, I mean, these are all small, either lawyers and stuff, or just they run small offices, accounting offices, this and that. And I mean, clearly, and that's one of the things Stead felt, was that Swigert was the only guy there who had any sense of, I mean, what a board should be doing, what a general manager should be doing. I mean, I think the fact the board deals with all this stuff about who gets what contracts and never, ever deals with policy questions is incredible. And wouldn't happen if you had, even if you had, it's not a question of city versus suburb or anything else, if you had people that knew what you were supposed to do on a board.
I think we've all failed, and I don't mean to pass this off of the board, but I think that SEPTA is, public transportation is a very important item in the region. And I think that the region has chosen to deal with it by placing volunteers on the board who have a number of disparate interests. You would think that we would all come into a room, sit down, and be gung-ho about public transportation, and that's why we were there. I assume that's not why we're there, because we've never had those discussions. So that a region which allows us, I suppose, to govern the system has made a statement about what it thinks about public transportation, I think. And I think that statement is that it's something that we have to deal with, because there's some people who need it, but it's not important. It's not a thing of value.
In February, Governor Robert Casey encouraged the appointment of Chester County resident and former federal prosecutor Clayton Underkoffler to the SEPTA board. At Underkoffler's first SEPTA board meeting, he was made chairman of the Transit Authority. Governor Casey had encouraged that move, too.
There's no question that under Clayton Underkoffler's leadership, I hope we get a more cohesive and cooperative spirit on that board, and a board which is concerned about operating efficiency, about keeping costs down, and remembering that they exist to run that system for the benefit of the public, for the benefit of riders, for the people that have got to get on that bus or that rail car every day to go to work.
My personal philosophy, which I also bring to it, is that a board should so consider itself as a policy-making body, one that considers broader issues. And when I say broader issues, I would say transportation philosophy and direction for the next 5, 10, 20 years.
A new chairman is able to bring new direction and the stability the Transit Authority needs at the top. But where is SEPTA headed, and in which direction should it go? Consultants, under the eye of suburban political leaders, are working on different visions of SEPTA's future. Options include shrinking SEPTA to put its service more in line with what it can afford, keeping SEPTA service the same, or expanding service to reach new markets. There's a push now for SEPTA to catch up with one regional trend, the movement of city dwellers to jobs in the suburbs, and the movement of workers from one suburban location to another. Reverse commuting is the buzzword that SEPTA is trying to learn. This office park in Fort Washington is one of 2 places where SEPTA is now running buses specifically to meet the needs of employers and their workers. But SEPTA can't pay for this operation on its own. The companies in this office park put up the money for the service to run. SEPTA provides the vehicles and the drivers. This part of SEPTA's future offers promise, but right now, SEPTA can't afford it unless it gets corporate help.
SEPTA should make use of every possible source of revenue it can find. And if there are people at shopping centers, if there are employers in the area who will contribute to the support of the SEPTA system, and by the way, they should, because some of those people benefit from the SEPTA system, SEPTA should make every possible effort to maximize that kind of contribution.
Al Delabovi is the head of the Urban Mass Transit Administration, or UMTA. He's a strong critic of SEPTA and says that it's a mismanaged transit agency. As a member of the Reagan administration, he's a vocal supporter of privatization of public services, encouraging private business to work independently or in partnership with agencies like SEPTA. On its own, SEPTA has identified 13 suburban locations where a service like one in Fort Washington could work. SEPTA is also beefing up some of its train and transit routes to meet the demand it associates with reverse commuting. But not everyone agrees SEPTA is taking the right steps.
If they start subsidizing services to the suburbs to an even greater extent than they are now, they're already more subsidized than city services. What you're doing is you are subsidizing employment locations by employers that are outside or very dispersed locations and difficult and costly to serve. And in terms of what that's going to do for the Philadelphia unemployed, suppose by subsidizing employment locations outside the city, you attract 2 or 3 firms like Cigna. You've already reduced the jobs in the city to such an extent that you've exacerbated, you've made the unemployment problem in the city worse.
The challenge facing SEPTA is survival, and beyond that, meeting the needs of a changing region. SEPTA and political leaders will have their say, as they have in the past. Riders, who have the largest stake in the system as commuters and taxpayers, have been absent from the debate. That will have to change if SEPTA is to progress from worrying about money and politics to concentrating on service.
I think that as a region that we're really selling ourselves short. If we're willing to accept, piecemeal dismantling of the system on a well-prioritized basis, what we really want to do is to maintain the system as it is, and then in the future evaluate what new investment, what enhancement to the system is, the best investment. But I think that we should at least seek to maintain what we have.
If you haven't spent the money on the power and signal systems and bridges, you have the crisis. It's there. So, stay tuned. Are people going to deal with it and spend the money or not?
This program was made possible by a grant